Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the I Have a Voice Caregiver Advocacy series. This is the first of four conversations in this series, which are taking place on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. right here on Facebook. My name is Olivya Wilson. I'm the Trauma Informed Parent Engagement Coordinator at Greater Richmond SCAN, and I have the pleasure of introducing our host for this evening. Actually, our host for this whole entire series. Her name is Tamika Daniel. And I also am excited to introduce her special guest, Chloe Edwards. Tamika Daniel is the Behavioral Health Community Organizer for Greater Richmond SCAN. Tamika is an East End community resident and mother of 4 children. She began advocating for the needs of her son with autism, and that led to her advocating on a larger scale in the 10 years of not being employed. She began as SCAN's Behavioral Health Community Organizer in August of 2019 through a partnership with Richmond Memorial Health Foundation. Utilizing her expertise and experience, she brings SCAN's work in adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and resilience to the community through trainings and forums such as this. She also assists in building resilience and facilitating healing through empowerment and connection through a trauma-informed and equity lens. Additionally, she brings her voice and advocacy to meetings and tables throughout the community. And so we're so appreciative and we're so grateful to have Tamika Daniel to serve as our host for these Caregiver Advocacy series. And then for our special guest today, we have Chloe Edwards. Chloe Edwards is the Advocacy and Engagement Manager at Voices for Virginia Children. She serves as a liaison between partners, advocates, and the Voices policy team, specializing in cross-disciplinary issues such as trauma-informed care and equity. In August 2020, Chloe launched Virginia's first Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week, which was recognized by Governor Ralph Northam. Now the initiative has evolved into Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, a campaign that empowers the voices and experiences of marginalized communities in acknowledgement of truth to promoting healing, reconciliation, and justice. In implementation, Chloe leads a coalition to shape the campaign's advocacy priorities and execute community work. Chloe currently serves as the founder of See Me, #IamHere, president of Black Lives Matter 804, and assistant director and digital organizer for the Truth Telling Project. Thank you, Chloe, so much for being with us this evening. And I also want to congratulate you again for recently being named on Style Weekly's Top 40 Under 40. We're so proud of you, and it's very well deserving. I'm going to hand this off now to Tamika, who will share more about the I Have a Voice Caregiver Advocacy series.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you all for tuning in. Advocacy has always been a major part of my life and everything I do as far as my children and my own needs as well. And I've also been able to assist others in becoming empowered and advocating for themselves as well. And with everything that's going on with COVID, I just felt that this was needed. And it initially started out as a bi-weekly series that would take place at 7 p.m. on Zoom. But we understood that with everything going on, sometimes people need this, but it's hard. People are tired. They get home from work. They have every intention on participating, but sometimes they just want to shower and go to bed. So we just felt that it would be better to serve everyone if we pre-recorded it for everybody and we post it, and then you guys could view it whenever you felt like it. No need to set time aside. You can just click on Facebook and watch it whenever you feel the need to. I felt that with our first topic, what is advocacy? The perfect person to join us was Chloe Edwards. She's one of the first people that I met when I started my career at SCAN. She's always encouraged me to embrace my story and where I'm from and to just continue to advocate on a bigger platform. She's exposed me to even advocate on the political aspect. So there was no other person that I felt would be helpful in us introducing this advocacy series. So I'm going to toss it back to you, Olivia, so we can get started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tamika. So taking into account that this conversation is introducing us all to the topic of advocacy, I think it's appropriate to start off by asking just what you said. What is advocacy? So how do you describe or define advocacy in your own words? And that's open to both you as well as Chloe.
Well, thank you both for having me and for hosting me. And thanks all for your warm remarks and your introduction as well. I guess I can go ahead and start off. So I'm Chloe Edwards. I work with Voices for Virginia's Children as our Advocacy and Engagement Manager. And so we specialize in all kinds of advocacy, primarily legislative advocacy, but my work is not only on the policy side, but also through community engagement and encouraging folks with the story to advocate for themselves and tell their story. So with that being said, there's ultimately three different kinds of advocacy, but it's not limited to this that I've witnessed in working in the field. There's self-advocacy, where an individual wishes to communicate their own interests, their story, which can be connected to something that they've gone through, a need that they want to voice that needs to be solved, or rights when it comes to human rights and all that we're witnessing right now through the modern civil rights or Black Lives Matter movement. It ultimately means understanding your own strengths and needs and how you can use that to convey your personal or political goals to other people. So ultimately, self-advocacy is learning how to speak up for yourself. On a different form of advocacy, there's individual advocacy, which can be informal or formal. It could be a parent advocating for their child. It could be, I often use kinship care as an example because often in the Black community, we have relatives raising children or grandparents raising grandchildren. Ultimately, when you're working with vulnerable populations like children or the elderly, someone may not be able to speak up for themselves. So it could be an advocate doing that on their behalf, or individuals who share similar experiences collectively speaking up together in a group format. So that an example of that could be like the Me Too movement. The other form, which we often bump into a lot, is systems advocacy, where you're challenging or you're changing policies. And then the human rights or civil rights perspective, it could mean not just working to preserve our systems or improving our systems, but ultimately changing our systems. When you think of policy, it could be at the local, state, or federal level. When you think of COVID-19 and how some of the stimulus packages like the CARES Act have come from at the national level, but trickled down to Virginia, so you can voice what that funding should be used or prioritized or needed for. This ultimately means changing laws, creating new laws, or targeting a specific problem, for example, police brutality within the Black Lives Matter movement perspective. Ultimately, advocacy in this manner is to support policy, legislative, or social change in order to combat the root cause of what it creates some of these issues. So long-winded, but advocacy is very broad in that perspective. It can come in all shapes and forms.
That was very helpful, Chloe. Thank you. And so what I heard is that the advocacy is very broad, and you were able to break it down and I believe it was like three forms. You mentioned self-advocacy, individual advocacy, which could be both formal and informal, and then legislative, a legislative form of policy. Tamika, did you want to add your thoughts to what you also feel advocacy is, or?
She, Chloe, she touched on pretty much everything, but I know for me, I didn't even know that I was advocating when I was doing it. a lot of times in the Black community where I come from, we pretty much tend to go with the flow. So I actually started with individual advocacy for my son. For so long, I always felt that whatever they were telling me was the correct thing, and that was it. Like I had to go with what they said, and just upon researching on my own and understanding that, hey, they may have good intentions, but I know what's best for my son, and it's okay for me to speak up. So to me, the individual advocacy aspect is what really stuck out to me and where I pretty much started at.
Thank you for sharing, Tamika. Chloe, when you were describing the different types of advocacy, you also were sharing examples, and what I was hearing in those examples were even talking about what I heard in those examples. I was starting to also hear why advocacy might be important. Could you speak to that even more directly about why is advocacy so important? Why should we be encouraging our caregivers to advocate?
Right. So from different perspectives, on the self-advocacy level, advocacy can have such a transformative change. It can change the trajectory of a person's life. When you think of a grandparent raising a grandchild that is reaching out for resources so that their grandchild does not go into the foster care system. Grandparents and kinship care often acts as the backbones of our systems. And so advocacy is important from that standpoint. When you think of a child being able to be kept in their community or having to live with strangers that they do not know. So I've witnessed a lot of grandparents advocating for their youth in that way, and I was raised by my grandparents myself, so can relate to that perspective. From a self-advocacy perspective, a lot of times when interacting with any of our systems, there is an innate distrust, especially from Black and Brown communities, which is totally understandable because of the racism that's perpetuated in our systems, in the medical field, mental health field, even in our social services systems. When you think of the kind of family that our workers may look at and say that obviously conform a little more to the white cultural norm, a lot of these Black and Brown families have to advocate for their children to get back their children, because oftentimes our households may look different because of the way equity is embedded in our systems. So a lot of families have trouble navigating the systems in general. And so it requires self-advocacy and speaking up for yourself, learning the systems, connecting with others who may experience the same challenges. And so self-advocacy becomes important in that way. Could be a child speaking up or consoling or trusting a teacher about what's going on in the household, and ultimately changing experiences with abuse or neglect, et cetera. When it comes to more of the individual change, when you think of things like the Me Too movement or Alcoholics Anonymous, advocacy in that manner becomes important because that collective experience is so important, and being able to empower yourselves through shared identities, or even cultural. For example, when you think of cultural trauma, being able to connect with your culture and other identities to feel like you have someone that you can trust in order to advocate for long-standing change on a larger scale. So often challenging norms of patriarchy when it comes to the Me Too movement, of women's rights being human rights. And then when you think of the Black Lives Matter movement, how collective that has been, it doesn't just become a form of oppression, but also a form of empowerment. Systems change is even more important now, and it's been important for a long time, but a lot of folks are paying more attention to it, because now through our advocacy, through those collective experiences, we have the opportunity to transform and challenge systems that perpetuate racism. And we're seeing it. We're seeing at the environmental level through some of the removal of the Confederate statues. We're seeing at the systemic level through a lot of police brutality policies that were just passed. And then we're seeing it at the preventative level, looking at how communities may need a little more resources because of the way that equity impacts the distribution of resources. So more funding for prevention and increasing support personnel in schools, things like that on a larger scale. So yeah, I mean, it's just, I always say one society does not stay the same, one person does not stay the same. We grow over time, society changes over time, whether you're in a rural locality, a suburban, or an urban locality. And so as a result, our systems have to conform to that change. And it may not be a matter of preserving it, but instead changing them.
That's really powerful, Chloe. Thank you. And I really appreciate you, highlighting that our society is ever evolving, is ever changing in this role of advocacy, how it has a really important role to be able to advocate for those changes, to adapt to how people change and how, like you said, society changes. Tamika, I just wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts as well before I ask the next question.
Yes. I think with everything that Chloe said, it just reminds me how, the three different forms, eventually end up intertwining with each other. Because as I stated, I started with the individual advocacy, with advocating for someone else, my son. But as I got older, I realized that it's only so much I could do for him when I'm not even advocating for myself on what I need. Like, I'm exhausting myself trying to make sure he gets everything he needs, but he can't get the best because I'm not my best. So I had to start advocating for myself. Going into the doctor's office, I'm stressed. And first thing is medication. And me just being honest, I don't need medication. I don't want medication. I just need help with learning how to deal with everyday stressors. And upon going through that, it led me to see that on a system level, it was more to why every time someone goes into a doctor's office with a of issue of I'm stressed, I'm having a hard time, that the first thing that's offered is medication and not help with into the root of what's going on. So it's like all of those things end up intertwining with each other. And that's why advocating is so important on each of those levels, because they intertwine at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I agree with that. They intertwine, and just like you were getting ready to say, it's like one affects the other ultimately at some point. And so I appreciate you both kind of, really speak into that very directly about why advocacy is important. And Tamika, you actually, as you were speaking, you were hitting on the next question that I had, which was what does or what can advocacy look like for caregivers in their everyday lives? And even just the example that you gave about in the process of advocating for your son, you realized that you weren't advocating for yourself and you needed to find what that looks like. And that looked at like going to speak to just your own doctor or seeking support for how to deal with your daily stressors. Do you have other examples or, ideas that can help those listening in on what advocacy can look like in their everyday lives?
Yes. Just paying attention to yourself, and if it and surrounding anything in your life, whether it be your children, yourself, their schooling, mental health, the community you live in. It's okay to not agree with what's going on. And that's what I had to learn. It's okay to not agree, and it's okay to speak on it. And that's what I had to learn for myself. So many times I just roll with the flow. Whatever that was said to me, okay, they know what's best. They're the professionals. I'm just gonna roll with it. But paying attention to myself and my son and where I live, I've realized it's okay for me to have an opinion and say, hey, this is not okay. So as far as the individual and self aspect, pretty much advocating for yourself just looks like, in my terms, speaking up for yourself. paying attention to your needs, your children's needs, whatever you need, your basic needs, your mental health need, educational needs, just speaking up. If you don't agree with something, it's okay to say, hey, I don't agree with this. This is not okay. And just research. I would say research. I had to learn that research was important. I couldn't go in there talking and didn't know what I was talking about. So I had to do my research. And upon learning that, I realized that I actually had a lot of say so. And sometimes when I would be met with resistance, is, hey, I know this and you have to do this. This document is law. So I would say that's why it's important, and just doing your research for whatever you want to advocate for.
Chloe, you referred to, as you were speaking earlier, you were referring to some specific examples of kinship care and how grandparents or other caregivers, utilize advocacy when they are, advocating to protect, their grandchildren or other children from going into, the foster care system or living, being adopted by, strangers, if you will. Wanted to also ask the same question to you, but perhaps maybe given some specific examples, if possible, of what does or can advocacy look like in caregivers' everyday lives? Like, what can that look like? Can it be who can they go to, or in what ways can they go about, advocating those different ways?
Right. So at the individual level, it makes me think about, I think I was between like 12 or 13. I had an aunt who noticed signs of abuse and neglect in the household and how I would shut down in front of my mother. And I know many children out here are often parentified at a young age. They grow up um, to be a parent, even at a child age, because of what's going on in their household with their parents, et cetera. And so that was the case for me. Because our system operates the way that it does, as a parentified child, I had to reach out to my siblings to extend the opportunity to them after I had opened up to my aunt about speaking up to get out of the abusive household. And not all three accepted the opportunity because of fear or shame or whatever. But ultimately, my sister and I got an opportunity to go um, into placement with my grandparents. Of course, because of the way our child welfare system works, it takes some time because reunification is always the goal, or family preservation is always the goal. And so I learned a lot through a court-appointed special advocate, who many do play also that caregiver role, a meeting with children once a week, and allegations of abuse, neglect, or child in need of services, to tell their story and to advocate on behalf of the child who cannot be in the courtroom. And not only did I learn about how CASAs navigate the systems and how court involvement is lengthy in general, but also recognize that my grandparents didn't receive any resources as kinship parents. So many who may be familiar with the system, if you're a foster parent, you do qualify for resources. But up until recently, aunts raising children, grandparents raising children, they do not receive resources unless it's a formal foster care placement. There are some policy changes that we've been working on at Voices to extend those kinds of resources to families through the Families First Prevention Services Act, for family preservation, and through the Kinship Navigators program, but that's still ongoing and very limited. And so how can families advocate for themselves? In this case, it was the court-appointed special advocates who served as a source of information. It was the parentified child learning kind of their rights and the system, navigating the system and speaking up, balancing what that looks like in practice and the risk that comes with it. But ultimately, I have to say there is no way to really navigate the system. I hope in the future it's a policy change to, like, my bucket list would be some sort of ombudsman office that would link all of our systems of care together so that parents could have one place to call and learn about there are resources that they can gain access to, but it doesn't exist at the local level. In Prince William, for example, some localities it does, but not at the state level. So it's kind of a bummer in that sense, but you can connect with other advocacy organizations. Voices has people call us all the time. And if we don't know the answer, we connect them to another agency that does. A lot of times families may need to access organizations that practice litigation, like the Virginia Poverty Law Center or Legal Aid Justice Center, if there's an injustice that they've experienced, or just connecting with other people like Tamika, who share shared experiences in navigating the systems as a whole. I will say it is important to also advocate for yourself in the process, though, so that you're not burnt out, because you can't be the best advocate if you don't take care of yourself first.
Absolutely. Thank you. You both dropped a lot of gems just now in talking about what does advocacy look like, or what can advocacy look like for caregivers in everyday. And just wanted to kind of repeat what I heard, and it was so much shared, is that number one, it really starts with realizing that you have a voice and that you can go to someone. And though sometimes it's hard navigating who that someone can be, who that resource is, but we can, connect to advocacy organizations, as you said, such as Voices for Children, connecting with other people with shared experiences, and probably in other different organizations or groups that dedicate their time and energy to advocacy, just to at least know that there's somewhere to start and to feel supported in that. And so I know there was a lot more that said, but those were some of the highlights that I just heard from that response. And Chloe, your last statement, you said if you don't take care of yourself, it could be really hard to be an effective advocate. And that made me think of this next question about, are there particular skills that one needs in order to advocate effectively, or what kind of skills does someone need to be an effective advocate?
Right. Well, I would say persistence first. I think of COVID-19 and how disproportionately that's affected Black and Brown communities. I think of health in general right now is really top of mind because of the pandemic. And I know, for example, when studying maternal and infant health mortality, that there are biases in our healthcare system that impact Black and Brown families in particular. And I know that plays a role in disproportionality of the outcomes that we witnessed with COVID-19, whether the data is collected in all localities or not. And I think of my own experiences as a young Black woman when trying to navigate the healthcare system. And so when it comes to individual experiences like that I know a lot of people are dealing with, it's important to be persistent. If something does not feel right, looking out for resources, advocating for yourself, going to a different provider if need be. Even when it comes to restaurants or localities that aren't following the rules, reporting them online. I've done a few times recently. And so I just wanted to bring that up because of the nature of ultimately we're in a dual crisis, which is the pandemic, but also racism as a public health crisis too. On the other scale, I'd say you really just need a willingness to learn and think outside of your own perspective in order to see that collective whole and how all of those perspectives we talked about earlier ultimately intertwine with one another. And so you don't ultimately become an expert until you reach out for help and you start studying how systems interact with people at the individual level, and that just takes a level of curiosity or an inclination to do so, really. And so I'd say often when I work with youth, they talk about their experiences, but what they don't know is that their stories are connected to other people who share the same experiences. And ultimately, I say your stories um, connect yourself to your gifts, and then your gifts connect you to people who matter. And that could look like some of these organizations. And so that's ultimately what's needed, is just the willingness to be open, but ultimately you have to be ready for that, because there is often underlying traumas or things we're all coping with that we have to surpass in order to be comfortable with sharing our experiences.
Tamika, would you like to add to that question as well? What kind of skills does someone need in order to advocate effectively?
Just pretty much piggybacking off of what Chloe said, that persistence is definitely gonna be key, because nothing happens overnight, and like she said, the willingness to be open and reach out. Like for me, the last couple years, like even with advocating for my daughter, I had to understand that, hey, even though I have been advocating for my son, I'm dealing with something completely different with my daughter now. So I need help. I need someone. And I did reach out to someone, and they were there with me every step of the way. I was still advocating, but I had help. I had someone who knew a little more than me about what I was going through, and they were able to help and guide me to pretty much uncover a lot of stuff that shouldn't have been going on. So that persistence, being willing to stick it out because it's gonna be tough, and being open to learn, um, to research. Like I said, that's a big thing for me. When my son was diagnosed with autism, I was 22. I didn't know the first thing about it, so I just went with whatever the doctors and therapists told me, until I realized that, I'm the one with my son, I'm the one that lives with him. I have to make sure he's getting the best care that he can possibly get. And with the lack of resources that are available to you willingly, it was definitely hard. So I had to be ready to get my hands dirty. I had to go out and find a lot of the things that I knew, because, as Chloe stated before, a lot of things are not just out there for us. Like she said, it would be ideal for everything to be in one place for parents and caregivers, but it's not. So that persistence and willing to learn and do your research.
Definitely. I can hear in your story, and even in some of Chloe's, sharing some of her childhood experiences, it sounds like oftentimes individuals who find their voice or learn that advocacy is something that that they are and want to pursue, especially as in terms of a career. It sounds like that is oftentimes inspired, if you will, by a personal experience. Um, is is there anything that you can say, Tamika, in particular, that inspired you to become an advocate, in addition to your experiences that you've had with supporting your children?
Um, Nothing in particular. I think just seeing how, people can be treated, when they're just going with the flow of things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like I said, for me, my biggest inspiration was just wanting to do better for my son. At that point, it was just me and him. So really just wanting to be the best parent and give him the best quality of life that I could, even though he was diagnosed with something that I had no understanding of. So that became my inspiration, is just getting him the help that he needed.
And Chloe, what about you? What would you say inspired you to become an advocate?
Mm. Well, ultimately, I credit a lot of my finding my voice to my aunt Rhonda, who got me out of an abusive situation as a child and inspired me to speak up. And ultimately, that my story has changed the trajectory of my life, but also that intervention, I think, and finding my voice through that experiences has has allowed me to amplify my voice on behalf of others too, outside of my personal experience. But ultimately, in the trauma-informed care field, we always say it's that one stable, caring adult, and that's proven to be true for me. I had a teacher in high school who never knew my story, but recognized that that I was going through something was not quite right. And it was a cultural, I called her Mama Mason. And so when it came to me going to the Minority Research and Law Institute after high school, she said, Chloe, I don't know how we're going to get you there, but even if I have to pay for a bus ticket on my own, you're going. And that's what connected me to my culture and my passion for social justice and racial equity. Um, at every point in my life, it's always connected to some sort of person. So following high school, I went to college. And when I studied sociology, I started writing papers and started using the perspectives to analyze my parents and their mental health issues, substance abuse issues, et cetera. And by writing my story, my professor learned it, even though it was research-based. And it connected me to who's now my mentor, Orca Fassetti, who was the first executive director of Connecting Hearts, a foster care and adoption agency. And so following high school, I was an ambassador for them for a few years. I worked my way up to director of that organization. And that connected me to my passion for child welfare advocacy. Then once again, I bumped into another adult who we connected from my story once again, Allison Gilbraith, who works for Voices for Virginia's Children. And so Allison is also a kinship foster care alum like myself. We sat in a meeting when I worked at Connecting Hearts. We connected on my story, and then that inspired me to advocate at the General Assembly on behalf of kinship care resources. So that deepened my passion for not just awareness, which I was doing a lot of at Connecting Hearts, but legislative advocacy and how you can make a larger impact through systems change. So ultimately, I'd say what's inspired me the most is my story, but someone listening to that story and hearing it and connecting me to even greater opportunities to amplify that on behalf of other people.
Thank you so much. I truly appreciate both you and Tamika being able to share how you all have been inspired to become an advocate and to be able to be open and transparent and vulnerable. And obviously you all have shared your story so many times, but I just still think about how still connected and impacted we are by our stories, and just how powerful they are that they're still shaping, and like you said, Chloe, changing our trajectories in life. And so I just really appreciate you all being very open and transparent about your stories, but then how your stories have helped shape who you are today and guiding where you're going today. We are coming close to our time, but I just had a few more questions, if it's okay with you both. We've been talking a lot about, what is advocacy, why it's important, what it can look like, how, what skills are helpful for us to go about advocating effectively, and how our inspirations have played a role in that. But I don't want to ignore that it's challenging, as it's already been stated, that advocacy can be very challenging. And so just wanted to maybe speak to that, or have you all speak to what are some challenges that caregivers can expect to run into, and then what keeps you motivated to continue advocating in the midst of those challenges?
I'll go first. I'll just touch on the biggest thing for me, which was roadblocks. They come in many sizes, shapes, and forms. They can sometimes come in the form of a person as well. Just speaking really quickly, my son, he's learned how to self-regulate, but at one point he was extremely aggressive. And me being his mom, I wanted to get him and one-on-one. And I was met with so much resistance. It's not in the funding. We got to follow this protocol. We have to go by this step. We have to do this. All the while he's getting put in handcuffs. Mind you, he's 13 years old, so he's been placed in handcuffs in school and everything. I'm freaking out. I'm having constant meetings. So it's just those roadblocks of, I know this is what my son needs. I know he can get those things, but constantly being in meetings and people telling me we can't do this. We have to do this first. Did you try this? We got to do it this way. But like me and Chloe spoke on earlier, that persistence, knowing that, this is something that he needs. He deserves this. He's entitled to this. So just being persistent, what keeps me motivated to know that, it's light at the end of the tunnel. So it took me 2 years, but he got his one-on-one, and he's had it for the past couple years. But I went through 2 years of roadblocks and constant meetings and, wanting to give up, wanting to snap on people, my baby's being placed in handcuffs, she's crying, but what am I going to do? Just really wanting to give up because those roadblocks were just so tough. And I'm like, do I really want to keep doing this? Do I really want to go through this anymore? It's stressing me out. It's stressing my baby out. Do I want to take him out of the school? But I'm so focused on, not just removing my son. I want to be the change that I want to see. So that's what keeps me motivated, knowing that at the end of the day, there is light at the end of the tunnel and the sun does shine and you will get results.
Thank you, Tamika. I appreciate you and those words of encouragement and just being very brutally honest about what those challenges are. Chloe, do you have anything that you would like? What are some challenges of advocacy and what keeps you motivated to continue advocating in the midst of those challenges?
I totally agree with Tamika. As you experience a lot of roadblocks, whether it's when advocating for yourself or on behalf of other people or on behalf of systemic change, which feels so large and so big and oftentimes so impossible to actually succeed at. Some of these issues that we advocated for are deep-seated, over 400 years of slavery, for example. And so how do you undo all of that through advocacy? And when you think back, or even now, when you're just looking at today, it feels as if we have not made that much progress. But when you take a look back and take a moment to reflect, we actually have made a ton of progress. And so I just think about the other advocates that came before me, civil rights icons. My two ones I really look up to as far as my cultural icons goes, it's Dr. Joy DeGruy and Angela Davis. I have pictures of them on my wall, and that keeps me going. But when I was in college, I had written a poem about my cultural and our history as a whole. And in the poem, I had said, it's not beautiful when you think of slavery and oppression and how that still carries a lot of weight today with what we face. And there's been initiatives that I've been a part of where I have had a lot of roadblocks and almost second guessed myself and continuing to pursue them, but still have because of that resilience. And so I'd say it's not ugly, and it is beautiful, and resilience is beautiful. And when you're able to lean on other people, allies, friends, family supports, cultural supports, counseling, because it comes with a lot of secondary trauma too, that's how you're able to really keep going.
Thank you, Chloe. And I have one final question, and that's how can caregivers feel supported in their advocacy efforts? So knowing that it can be challenging, and knowing that that we will find people or things that help keep us motivated through the midst of those challenges. What type of supports when you're out there doing the work can caregivers seek?
So you can, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Um, I would say for me, it's just, as Chloe stated earlier, reaching out for help. Um, that's the biggest thing for whatever you're advocating for. Try to find someone, that's good in that area to reach out to, because you're going to need that support. And for me, it was my son's counselor. It took, and that was another thing that was hard. It took me a long time, but I was able to get him a black man, as his counselor, because I knew he needed to see a positive black man, and how they move. So just knowing, being open to admit where you're lacking and being willing to seek help in that area, because those people are really going to be your backbones. This man has become a staple in me and my sons and my other children's lives. And he plays a big part in all of the decisions and things that I've been able to get for my son. So just knowing your limit and knowing you don't have to do everything by yourself. So for me, that's the biggest thing, just reaching out to someone.
Yeah, I have similar experience. So I I specialize in everything that I've gone through, which is something I didn't quite realize until I got older and realized I was doing foster care advocacy and trauma informed care advocacy and now justice. And so that carries a heavy weight, especially if you've experienced what you're advocating for. And you may not recognize the signs of secondary trauma, but it's something that I started to be more mindful of, and recognizing how me being so close to my work and living through it has impacted me. And oftentimes I take on so much because of that, because I feel like I need to commit myself to as much as possible. So I did similarly reach out and find a Black women counselor because I needed someone that understood my lived experience of trauma, specialized in trauma, but also recognized how racism and oppression impacts my day-to-day experiences too. And so that's played a huge difference in my life in learning how to find more of that balance more. And then also knowing your role, you can't take on everything, which it's been difficult, but I finally have been able to take some things off of my plate and recognizing it. And sometimes it's even more powerful to play a support role and support others rather than leading the work on your own. Because ultimately you're a better advocate when you're able to actually commit to everything that you're doing authentically. And then lastly, advocacy days are very exciting. You get to connect with other people who share similar experiences as you, so it can be very empowering as well. And so through Advocacy Days, which Voices hosts each year, you're able to connect with other advocates for a collective day. So you're not doing it all on your own that day. And then hopefully you're able to make some long-term connections and staying connected to some of those people. So before I worked at Voices, the Kinship Care Advocacy Day was very empowering, and it was my first experience, and it was so exciting to be able to impact positive legislation. And now that we have other advocacy days, I can still say the same. You're trained, so you feel like you have the resources because you're trained in order to be successful, and you're not doing it alone. So you can reach out to us. We're planning 3 this year, early childhood education. We have a foster care youth cohort, and we're still accepting applications for our campaign for our Trauma-Informed Virginia Racial Truth and Reconciliation Advocacy Day up until the 23rd.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll make sure that we find a way to input those advocacy days, information about the advocacy days in this video, or somehow connected, put it in the chat when this airs on Facebook Live going forward. And so I am going to toss it to Tamika to close us out. But before that, I just want to ask if there are any closing or final thoughts that Tamika, you or Chloe, you would like to share before we end our time today?
No, just thank you for this opportunity. Thanks for having us, and please feel free to share my contact information if anyone would like to reach out. It's Chloe, CHLOE @vakids.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Tamika is in your hands.
Okay, I just want to thank you guys for joining me today, especially you, Chloe. It was so last minute, and the fact that you took the time out your busy schedule to fit this in, I truly appreciate it. Just for everyone, when I say she's introduced me to a more in-depth look at what advocacy can look like, because for me at first it was just individual and self, individual and self. And I attended my first advocacy day in January, and it was all that Chloe said. So thank you again, Chloe, for everything that you do and that you'll continue to do.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We'll be back on December 2nd for I Have a Voice, which is advocacy and education. So I look forward to seeing you guys December 2nd at 7 p.m. on Facebook. Thank you, everyone, again.